Well, thanks for coming today. My name is Dave Smith. Most people just call me Dizzy, though. There's a lot of Dave Smiths in the world. Dizzy's a much easier name to remember. And I'm speaking today about managing, nurturing, and building distributed teams. I've heard a lot of talks over the years about sort of what works for different companies. You know, we use technique Y, and we do this, and everything just works. And my question is, as sort of a former engineer myself, is how do we engineer this stuff? How do we take a more systematic approach? And so that's really what I want to talk about today. I hope to give you some theoretical underpinnings that the things that I think about when I run distributed teams, that maybe it'll be helpful for you. And when I say you, this talk is for managers. So that's sort of my expectation here, that you're a manager, a director, a VP, something along those lines. So the first question is why me? This is me at work, courtesy of DigitalOcean PR. I'm a director of engineering, director of cloud engineering for DigitalOcean. This is what I look like in my natural work environment, doing Hangouts. But why me? In 2010, or up until 2010, I was a pretty happy programmer. I liked writing code. I really never wanted to manage people. They were very non-deterministic. I just really wanted to, just to grow old writing code. And then I had a bit of a life perspective change. I got diagnosed with cancer, went through all this. I was faced with my own mortality. And this process of realizing you're going to die changes what you value. It changes the things that you pay attention to, the things that don't bother you anymore. And so for me, this changed my viewpoint of what I wanted to do with the time that I had left. What is it that I want to leave behind? My code is normally thrown away within a couple of years, right? Like we all write code. It's super ephemeral. It gets thrown away. It's not, it's not a judgment on the value of the code. It's just life. And I realized that I really liked investing in people, and that if I looked back over my career to that point, that the most significant and valuable expenditure of my time was in coaching and mentoring other people. And so that's how I got into management. And so, along those lines, I sort of developed a mission that what I want to do with my life, my mission is to create environments where people do the best work of their lives. And there's a sort of a corollary to this in that machines don't write code, people do. And so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to create these environments. And that's really relevant to this talk because I believe that this is the work and life of a manager. Not necessarily to do the individual work, but to create these environments, to connect people with purpose. There's a lot of distributed teams out there that have worked, but I really want to make them work in a reliable way. Where I'm not just getting lucky, where I'm not depending on presence of personality or something like that, where I'm building a distributed team that works because I'm being disciplined and being focused and deliberately working to construct environments. So in order for us to talk about this, we have to talk just briefly about what a distributed team is. Well, it's people plus work minus location. Pretty straightforward. I think most people would agree with this definition. Now, what's the implication of this? If you take away location, if you take away people coming to a place and doing work together, what binds the people together? And that really brings us to being united by purpose. And that's really the job as a manager of a distributed team, is that you have got to unite people who aren't sitting in the same place, who eat lunch at different times a day. You've got to get them all heading in the same direction, as Seth said in the talk before, moving from A to B. And you've got to do that by uniting them in purpose. And so that's really what you're trying to do with a distributed team. That's going to be one of the things you struggle with. But now you've got to sort of think a little bit about what forces are at work on a distributed team. In other words, when you're not sitting in the same office together, what forces are you dealing with on a daily basis that you as a manager have got to take into account? And they're actually pretty simple. It's space and time. Now, I wanted to make a joke about Doctor Who here, but I'm just not adept enough at jokes or Doctor Who to do that. But at the end of the day, we are dealing with space and time. When we say space, we really mean location. And when we say time, we're actually talking about time zones. But these are two forces that are going to pull your teams apart, that you're going to have to actively fight against if you're running a distributed team. You have to think about these things. A lot of people, they look at a distributed team and they're like, well, it's not really any different than running any other team. Well, I'll tell you, other teams don't have this working against them, and this is a big deal. One of the just a natural side effect, right, of not sitting in the same place is that you don't have things like lunch. Right? A lot of us don't realize lunch is a natural clock synchronization system. Right? It naturally builds cadence into teams, into when people come and go, into conversations. You don't have that in a distributed team. How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to make sure that people are staying in sync or are taking time out to sit together and talk? What are you going to do? Another thing that distributed teams have to deal with on the time scale is that they tend to be really asynchronous. So things are just happening all the time. How do you make sure that people don't drift? How do you make sure that people don't sort of wind up moving away from the purpose? And so at the end of the day, what you as a manager have to do is bring a counterbalance into play, and that is effective communication. Now this effective communication is not the solution, to be very clear here. This is a tool. I like to think of it as it's like a trellis in a garden. If you set up this framework, this trellis of effective communication, you're going to enable your team to grow into that and be united in purpose. It's like when you plant that vine and it's growing on that trellis, it's going in a certain direction, it's going up. And it's able to do that because that trellis provides form to it. So we're going to spend some time now talking about communication because it's the one lever that you have as a manager of a distributed team that really enables you to fight these sort of tidal forces of space and time. But before we get into that, I want to bring one thing up because this always comes up in conversations that I have when people ask me how do distributed teams work. And that is that communication always takes the cheapest path. Now, if you've ever been a remotee, someone who is on a team where most of the team is over in one place and you're remote, you'll know that this is actually the root cause for all of your pain. Because people will forget to include you in a conference call. They'll not talk to you, not include you in a discussion and things like that. And so being aware of this as a manager and keeping this at the forefront of your mind is going to allow the communication to work well. Now, practically speaking, at DigitalOcean, 80% of my engineering team, which is about 60 people, are distributed across the US and Europe. But we do have a headquarters in New York and now an office in Boston. And so one of the ways that we deal with sort of communication taking the cheapest path is we make sure it's very cheap for people to get together on a hangout or have, share a screen or things like that. All of our conference rooms are equipped with, hangout machines and speakerphones and stuff like that. And it's really important to make it easy for that communication to flow because you don't want that communication pooling anywhere. So this is something to keep in mind, but let's now talk a little bit about communication in a more systematic way. And being an engineer, I came up with a system. So in my case, I started with dimensions, because the first thing you do with a problem is figure out what the dimensions in which you're operating. I like to break it down into 3 dimensions. One of them is latency. How quickly do exchanges occur within a team? Are they just like instantaneous? Do they take a lot of time? And of course, if we're going to have latency, we have to have throughput. You can't have one without the other. I did a lot of networking coding when I was younger, so if that's not obvious. How deep are the exchanges, though? In other words, how much content are you exchanging between teammates and teams? And finally, of course, we have cost. What's the overhead of the exchange? And so using these 3 dimensions, then, we can start looking at the different forms, or what I call modalities of communication, and figuring out how to leverage them. Now, again, what I'm trying to do here is give you a conceptual framework for thinking about what's going on in a distributed team. So these dimensions are ways of evaluating different forms of communication. So let's make a table. What about email, right? Email, from my perspective, the latency is very high. It takes a while to write an email, But again, the throughput is also very high. You can convey huge amounts of information in emails. And we've seen this sort of to be true over sort of a long span of time. Major open source projects typically have a very active mailing list. It's a great way to move a lot of information around. It just takes a while to do it. The cost is moderate because it takes a while to write an email. So it's not like it's really cheap to sit down and write an email. Now, you can write an email very quickly and not convey very much information, and it gets cheaper. But I digress. But then another form of communication, instant messaging, right? It's a moderate amount of latency. It's not instantaneous, but it's pretty quick. It's a very low throughput, though. You can't convey a whole lot of information very quickly. It takes a while, a lot of typing. But the cost is also very low. You're very interruptible, that you can be doing other things at the same time. So it's a very valuable tool. And I want to be really clear here. The reason why it's important to consider each of these with these different dimensions is because you need to use all of them in different situations. So that's what we're trying to do here. Let's talk about video conferencing. Skype, Hangout, whatever you want to call it. Low latency. You can just start talking right away. Your throughput is moderate. It's not quite face-to-face, but almost there. And the cost is pretty moderate. You do have to pay attention. You don't have to go anywhere, but you do have to be paying attention for the conversation to be meaningful. And so the final one that I like to think about is face-to-face. It's very low latency, very high throughput, but the cost is also excruciatingly high. You have to be in the same physical place with that person. And you have to be paying attention to them, ideally. If you're having conversations and you're not paying attention, I don't know what to tell you. So we have all of these different modalities of communication. And I've seen companies where they have a distributed team and they're like, we do everything on Slack, where I am. I've seen other places where they're like, we only use email. And we also have tons of examples of places where they say, you have to be here face-to-face all the time. I believe that every solution has trade-offs as an engineer. In my particular case, I actually happen to believe that having everything always be face-to-face is not a good idea. I think engineers actually need downtime. They need separation. So from my perspective, the best mix is video conferencing plus IM plus email with face-to-face as an occasional side. That's how I prefer to run my teams anyway. But I think it's very interesting that once you have a framework for evaluating these different forms of communication, it becomes obvious that you need to use them for different situations. And so as a manager of a distributed team, you've got to be paying attention to these different characteristics. So what does that sort of lead us to now? That means that you've got to choose your modalities wisely. And that means you've got to be, as a manager, paying attention to what your team's discussing and making sure that they are discussing the things that make sense in the right form. Because if you don't, for instance, consider, if you have a conversation over IM, right, that's about a very deep design discussion, you might miss really important points because everybody's just typing as fast as they can, trying to exchange details, and not thinking it through. So that's sort of inefficient, right? On the other hand, if you're having sort of a lightweight policy discussion or something like that over email, you might be taking a lot of time for people to compose really detailed thoughts about something that we just need a decision on, and we might revisit it later anyway. So as a manager, your job is to be paying attention to this because you've got to guide the conversations to the correct forum. Now, a great example of guiding a conversation is I've seen PRs, right? That people sit down and write a pull request. And then someone responds to it and says, that PR, I don't agree with it. I think your spacing's all wrong, and all this and that. And then it turns into just this long thing where they're talking about the PR. And as a manager, you've got to watch out for that stuff because people can really auger in on stuff. And so the question is what do you do? Well, those sorts of conversations, I would say, you should consider a couple of different modalities. If the PR is really dragging on, maybe getting everybody on a Hangout to talk about it might be a great idea. And Hangouts are particularly interesting for this because you don't have to sort of pull everybody into a specific place. But they are face-to-face, so that you remember the humanity. Because I think this is actually one of the big big challenges with distributed teams and all these different forms of communication is that if you don't see the face, you're not activating chunks of your brain that's, hey, that's a human person. This is why we get flame wars. It's a big part of that. And so as a manager, you need to be guiding the conversation to the correct place. And you need to be thinking about, hey, if this conversation goes on for too long, I need to ship it over here so that we can make a decision on it. And when you're proactive at that, you really are nurturing your teams and helping make sure that they keep growing at a good pace. So let's just quickly review the forces at work that we've been talking about. Distributed teams, they're united by purpose. And that's your job as managers to create that purpose. And you're fighting space and time to keep them united. And really your multi-tool here is going to be effective communication. So that's sort of the parameters in which you're operating. Now let's talk a little bit about what you really need to be doing in a distributed team. And I think that there's sort of three things. You need to be staying aligned on what's happening. You need to stay in touch with people. And you got to keep your eyes on the horizon. And I want to dig into each of those. So when it comes to staying aligned, you are constantly sort of in this battle, right, with space and time that are going to try and drive a wedge in your communication. So you got to make sure you're communicating about the right stuff. And alignment in this particular case means that you're trying to make sure that your team and you have a shared view of the world. That you both agree on what's important and what needs to be done and what's being done and the timing of it and all this stuff. So there's sort of three specific things that I like to pay attention to that I use in my teams. And one is progress. What, why, and blockers. Now, as managers, our job is really not to focus on the how. The expectation is that you hire teams that are capable of doing work, that you hire adults, and that you make sure that you connect them with the vision. You tell them what needs to be done. You make sure they understand why it's important, and you make sure that there are no blockers in their way. That's your job as a manager. But you need to talk about the progress. And the goal is to keep everybody on the same page about, hey, we're making progress on this, because that starts to build up sort of a cadence and unity over time. And I think it's worth noting here, Seth kind of mentioned this in his talk as well, that your job as a manager is to be an interrupt handler, right? As an engineer, you're flow-driven, right? You should be digging into the flow, working on problems. As a manager, your job is to handle interrupts as they come in, and that means you're going to context switch a lot, and you got to get used to it, and you got to be okay with it, because your job is no longer to do the work. Your job is to make sure that the people doing the work have what they need, have the correct vision, and know where they're going so that they can run full throttle. That's your job as a manager. And so to talk about progress, it's going to be high level. Sort of, we're making progress on this. We ran into these blockers. And sometimes you'll say, well, OK, I'll step in and make sure that that's taken care of for you. But sometimes you just talk through what they're wrestling with. And in the process, you'll help them sort of figure out how to attack something new. But it's sort of serendipitous, and it's sort of the rubber ducky effect, if you've heard of that. You talk to the rubber ducky, and all the problems become clear. So that's one of the things I like to stay aligned on. Another thing I like to stay aligned on is priorities. Now, it might seem really weird to talk about priorities after we've talked about progress. Most people are like, well, wait, shouldn't we know what needs to be done first and then talk about the progress on it? I actually believe that staying aligned on priorities after you talk about progress is a very useful sort of twist because it lets you adjust priorities. And as a manager, you're trying to shepherd a team sort of from point A to point B, as Seth was saying. And you do that by giving them sort of a numbered list of, look, here's the most important things that need to be done. Here's why it needs to be done. But sometimes, based off that progress, you're going to have to change the priorities. So I think it's really important to talk about priorities often and openly, because one of the biggest things you're going to struggle with as a manager, of a distributed team or not, is keeping everybody aligned about what's the most important thing to be working on. It's very easy to get distracted in the day-to-day. A customer issue comes up, you have tech debt, we want to redesign this thing. But what's most important? You need to be asking that question as a manager because you've got to help people keep track of that. I really like to use a numbered list. I like just a very simple list. A, B, and C. Those are that's not actually numbers, but you know what I mean. I like to have an ordered list, let's put it that way, that makes sure that it's very clear, hey, feature X is the most important thing. And there might be parallel work happening, right? There might be work in a bunch of different directions going on. But at the end of the day, if the shit hits the fan, everybody knows what has to give to make sure feature X ships. Finally, we've got to stay aligned on people. And I like to structure this as praise, feedback, and challenges. Machines don't write code, people do. And as managers, it's our job to pay attention to this. If you're not paying attention to your people, especially in a distributed team, you're missing a big part of the picture. It's not just about the work. It's about the people doing the work. Morale and frustrations, these things are important things for you to know as a manager because you're creating an environment, remember? And as you create that environment, taking into account, hey, this particular process is not helping people be more productive, that's important to know. So that means that when you need to be talking about sort of, especially, this applies a little bit more at a director or VP level, but you need to be talking about, how do we give praise to this person? How do we give feedback to this person so that they'll really start growing in this way? And how do we figure out what to do with this person that's not doing so well? How can we help them grow, give them the feedback they need to hear? But this is really important for you to stay aligned on. So when we talk about staying aligned, I like to focus on progress, what, why, the blockers, priorities, what's most important, and people. Making sure you're talking about praise and feedback and what the challenges are. Any questions so far? All right, I'm going to keep moving. If you got questions, bring them. So we're staying aligned, but now we need to stay in touch. Alignment ensures the team can operate sort of, when you're not around or they're sort of got questions or whatever. In other words, it allows you to operate without physical presence. Right? We're a distributed team, we don't have a physical presence. Staying in touch ensures that your team stays human, which is a really important thing. Think about it. When you hear about great things being done by teams of people, it's because their imagination has been captured, and they are fired up because they believe in what they're doing. When you capture that imagination and that passion, it is the most effective way to generate productivity in a team. And so it's important as a manager to stay in touch with your team. So I like to stay in touch with one-on-ones, right? Connect with the person. A regular cadence is really important for this. As a manager, you shouldn't reschedule it unless things are falling apart or you absolutely can't avoid it. You shouldn't reschedule it, and you certainly shouldn't cancel it. Because this is time for you to get really important and actionable intelligence from the people doing the work. I highly recommend using two-way video when you're doing a one-on-one, particularly in a distributed team, because again, it brings that human element back into play. Now, a couple of things about one-on-ones. You need to make sure that you're building sort of a non-work rapport. And we call this small talk. Now, this is hard for me, even in a face-to-face setting. So if it's hard, don't worry about it. It's hard for everybody. It's hard for a lot of us that are geeks anyway. But you have to do this. Because this creates a human connection with the person, which is the basis of trust. And over time, it enables you to connect with them and help them and be able to give them hard feedback and be able to receive hard feedback from them as a manager, because you're not immune to that feedback either. It's also really important to listen. Now, a lot of people are like, okay, well, I sat there. I sat there the whole time and they talked, and then, it just feels like we're not making any progress. And the truth is that that's not listening. That's sitting there. Listening is absorbing what the other person is saying, and not so that you can respond right away. It is absorbing what the other person is saying and sitting with it a minute, and then getting curious about it and asking questions. This is what you do as a manager. This is your work, right? Listen and be curious, especially in one-on-ones. And you will find that whole new horizons open up in what your teams are able to do, because they feel listened to. You got to get out of your own head. You can't anticipate what they're going to say. Just absorb it, consider it, sit with it. Now, the last part of Doing a good one-on-one is knowing when to sit with silence. You're going to have awkward silences. I'll tell you, you're going to have people that cry sometimes when they're going through a hard time. Now, it's funny. When people laugh, we don't think anything of it. When they cry, everybody's like, oh my God, what's happening? Scary things, apparently. But it is just another human emotion, and you are working with humans. They are non-deterministic, and that's okay. You can actually use that to your advantage. But you need to know when to sit with silence and when to just be there with them. And it's scary sometimes, because it feels like as managers, as leaders, we always feel like we have to know what happens next. But the reality is that we don't. Our job is to facilitate the work being done, to make sure there's no blockers, to connect them with purpose, and to be there for them. And so, it's important. So that's one-on-ones. Another way to stay in touch with your team is what I call leadership sync. So in my particular case, I have about 6 teams. I meet with each of them every week for about 30 minutes. And I connect with the engineering managers and the tech leads. Now, I find that using a standardized agenda really helps there. It drives urgency. It ensures alignment with that team, because those people are the ones that are making sure that the work's being done on your behalf. And I have a standardized agenda that I use, which is kind of similar to what I was talking about earlier, right? We have recruiting, progress, and priorities. Because at DigitalOcean, we're constantly hiring. We're growing really fast. So recruiting is actually a really important thing to talk about for each team. Are you getting enough candidates? Are the candidates of the right caliber? Do we feel like there might be a hole in the interviewing process? We talk about the progress that the team is making, because we have to make sure that they keep making progress. And finally, we talk about priorities. So we wrap up this sync with a discussion around, are the priorities that we have the right priorities? And that's a two-way conversation. I certainly come into the meeting thinking, here's what I think is important. But as we talk through things, as we connect, I sometimes realize, no, that's not important. And they're like, hey, look, this needs to be the top priority thing so that we can keep things moving. I'm like, OK, let's do it. 30 minutes per team is about how long I spend doing this, staying in touch with them. It turns out that that's actually a pretty good amount of time. When you have a structured agenda, when they come prepared, you can actually get a really good read. And since I've started doing this, I can say that I really feel a lot more connected to my teams, because I can know at any given time I'm no more than 5 or 6 days off from what's happened last. And we also wind up using a running doc of the agenda. So we just use a Google Doc for each team. And then we just copy the agenda each week. And what that lets us do is actually see trends over time, which is great for conversations when teams get stuck, as they always do, not because they're not doing the work, but because the work is hard. We can look back over and say, well, gee, we've been stuck on this for 4 weeks now. We probably ought to change our approach here, or do something different. So these are just things that I have found are really helpful. But the bottom line is that you've got to stay in sync with your leadership team. Because the farther sort of away you are from the people doing the work, the more important it is to make sure that you are connecting with those leaders and connecting them back to the purpose and the vision. The final way that I like to stay in touch personally is I have office hours, but I also do proactive outreach. Now, when I first joined DO, I tried to do one-on-ones with the entire organization. Then my job was doing one-on-ones, which is not my job. So that didn't really work. That might work in a smaller organization. What I did instead was I carved out 2 hours every Wednesday. And I said, look, these are my office hours. If you've got questions, you want to talk about something, or you're concerned about something, I don't care who you are, what part of the company, come talk to me. And then I go out hunting, and I go look for people to talk to, and try and figure out, who should I be talking to? What am I missing? A little bit of paranoia never hurts to be. It never hurts to be a little paranoid as a manager. But again, you're trying to be deliberate here, and that's a recurring theme with all of this. With all of this stuff and all the system, is that you've got to be deliberate about how you communicate with people in a distributed team. If you just try and fly by the seat of your pants, you're going to miss stuff, and you're not going to get stuff done. And you're going to wonder what happened. And you won't know what happened because you haven't been deliberate about staying on top of it. So in review, staying in touch. Use one-on-ones to connect with the individuals. Use leadership syncs to make sure that you're keeping the purpose driven across all levels and all teams. And proactively reach out to other parts of your organization. So now we've got sort of, we've talked about staying aligned, we've talked about staying in touch. The last sort of piece of this then is keeping an eye on the horizon. You've been focused on keeping sort of your communication and your priorities tight. You're paying attention to the people and the work that they do. You got to make sure now that everything's sort of moving, you've got standard ways of doing things, you're using all the right modalities. Now you've got to make sure as a leader that you don't get overwhelmed by details, because that can happen too, right? You can't get distracted by the details. So you've got to keep an eye on the horizon, because really as a manager, that's another part of your job. Where your team is looking down at the immediate problem, you're supposed to be looking up and around and sort of watching their backs and making sure everything's being taken care of at the next level up. And each manager is sort of looking farther and farther out. I like to think of sort of individual contributors as sort of looking down at their feet and sort of the problems there. A manager is looking sort of in the general vicinity. A director is looking, kind of out to the horizon. And your VPs are way up there in space trying to keep a bird's eye view of what's going on. No offense, Seth, but I think it's important to think about that, right? Is that each piece of management has a really important purpose. And it's to support all the other pieces. It's not about rank here. This is about what your role is to support the organization. And every part is important. So you've got to sort of maintain this situational awareness. A few simple things you can do. One of the best ways of doing this as a manager is asking when things will be done. This sounds really obvious, but I've run into a number of managers, and they're like, this project's been going for 6 months now, and I'm really not sure what to do. And I'm like, well, when's it going to be done? And they're like, I don't know. I haven't asked that question. I'm like, whoa, that's kind of an important question, so I thought I'd put it on a slide. It's an important question to ask, though, because it drives urgency. It helps people know that as a manager, you're paying attention to it, right? Now, you might think, oh, great, now my manager's going to start asking me every 5 minutes, when's it going to be done, when's it going to be done? As a manager, don't do that, right? You ask the question, but you ask it sparingly. And you pay attention to when to ask it. But it's an important question to ask because you're telling people, hey, this is still important, when's it going to be done? And if you do it right, and you do it sort of in the right interval, you also create a safe space for them to say, I don't know. And that's an OK answer. You want to hear that. You want to know when they don't know. Because if you don't have that trust, you're in a lot of trouble. So you want to sort of foster that environment of discussing problems. And here's the other thing as a manager. When you've asked this question and you've gotten a good answer, you can put your mind at ease and step away from it. And that's very powerful because you're not worrying anymore. You've asked the important question, when's it going to be done? And they've said, 2 weeks, we feel confident about that. You're like, great, I got to go worry about something else now. So it's a powerful question, but it helps you sort of keep your eyes on the horizon. And a great corollary to this is, if it's not done yet, and you said it was going to be done, why is that? Not because you want to punish them or anything, but because you need to understand why it's not done yet. It's important. These questions are simple, but you've got to be asking them. Another way to keep an eye on the horizon that I found useful is scheduling some time to think and plan. Now, the great thing about sort of running a distributed team is that you naturally have to be pretty regimented in everything you do. My calendars are usually packed, every 30 minutes every day of the week. But what I have found is that it's important to carve some time out to just sit and think about stuff and not talk to other people, but just focus on sort of what else is going on that I haven't been paying attention to. The other great thing about this is that if you're doing these leadership things, particularly if you're a director or VP, the leadership things have given you a lot of context. And so you'll go into these sort of thinking times and can spend some time really strategizing because you have a rough idea of what's going on in the organization because you've been systematic about pulling all of that out. So in a distributed team, you got to do these 3 things. You got to stay aligned on what's happening. You got to stay in touch with people. You got to keep your eyes on the horizon. You got to do this, frankly, with any team, right? This isn't just distributed teams, but it's a part of it. This is sort of, from my perspective, how you manage and nurture a team. by paying attention to the communication, by keeping people aligned, by connecting with them on a regular basis. But the question then becomes, how do you build one of these things? How do you build a distributed team? And I'd like to focus on hiring because we have limited time left. But I think it's worth noting here that a lot of times you can't influence hiring. A lot of companies have sort of laid down the process, and this is how it's going to be. But I'd like to walk through some things that I found are really useful that you might be able to take back. And if you do, it will let you build a distributed team more easily. First and foremost, you're going to have to push for diversity. This is important. Why, you might be asking? Well, two reasons. These are just sort of the two that I've got because this is how much time we've got. But first off, we know that, for instance, gender-balanced teams increase revenue by 41% in one study. It makes a huge difference. Another good reason, they found that diverse teams tend to focus more on facts and be more innovative as a result of it. That's a Harvard Business Review. So we've got some really good reasons for why. Another good reason why is that the reality is that the tech field as a whole is massively skewed. Massively skewed. One estimate puts it at 90% men, 10% women in one situation, versus the medical field, right? The medical field, which is not known for diversity either, they're at 60-40. I've got 5 minutes. All right, I got to get cranking. Bottom line, this is really, really important, and you need to be paying attention to it. And if you don't start paying attention to it at the beginning, it's going to be really hard to get going in the end because nobody wants to be the first person into a monoculture. So how do I hire people without meeting them in person? That's sort of the big question. I've made my decision to push for diversity. Now how am I going to hire people without meeting them in person? And here's sort of the mind blower. Interviewing in person is not better than interviewing over the phone. That is a bias. That is your brain telling you, oh, if I can just see the person in person, I'll get a good read on them because I can just read people. And we know from a ton of studies that people are really bad at reading other people, and that our biases are all over the place in that situation. So the truth here is that the system matters more than the media. In other words, your system for interviewing is going to matter a lot more than what media, face-to-face or over Hangouts or over a telephone, when it comes to interviewing. I like to look at it this way. Good interviews are like good crypto, right? Good crypto, we can publish all of the details. I can tell you exactly how RSA works or how AES works in explicit detail, and it's still a secure system. And a good interview is the same way. I can tell you all the questions I'm going to ask you because there are no secret answers. There are no trick questions. I can tell you everything that I'm going to ask, and it's still going to be give me a good indication of whether or not the candidate will be a good person for the job. So in my particular case, I've used a system in the past where I do a screening call. I spend about a half hour doing that. I ask questions like, what are your career goals? What are you good at professionally? Things like that. I do a chronological interview where I am going through somebody's resume in chronological order and getting them to tell me the story of their career. This works really, really well. A lot of people like to read resumes from sort of in reverse chronology. Turns out humans are really bad at telling you a story backwards. Try to say the alphabet backwards. It doesn't work very well. Now try to ask someone about their job experience backwards. Do you think you're going to get great answers? You're not. So, again, I have a standard set of questions that I ask for each job. What were you hired to do? What accomplishments are you most proud of? Et cetera. And then I typically wrap it up with a technical screen. I like to use compare and contrast questions because what that allows me to do, again, is to have standardized questions. And that's really, really important. Sorry, I'm really flying here now. A few things to remember. When you're interviewing someone, you need to talk less than the candidate. I've been in interviews, I've heard of interviews where people are like, yeah, the interviewer talked for 20 minutes and then they asked me questions for 10. That's not an interview. That's I don't know, a soliloquy or something. And your job as a manager when you're interviewing is to hear what's going on. Again, to get curious, to try and figure out what makes this person tick. Why are they going to sort of drive this team to whole new levels? What amazing skills do they bring to bear? You're not going to get that if you don't ask them questions. This brings us to the next point. You've got to be prepared when you go into an interview. You can't just go into an interview and think, all right, I've read their resume, I'm ready to go. Why are you interviewing this person? What role are you trying to get them to fill? Know what success will require. And of course, you've got to be curious. This is really hard as an introvert. You sit down with a person, you're like, okay, I've got to talk to you for an hour. All right. If you prepare for it and come into it, put yourself in the mindset of, this is a person I want to understand. This is a person I want to understand. Do that. Have that mindset. Be curious. I think, and I like to say, ask all the questions. Keep asking questions. You got to be careful, because sometimes you can make people uncomfortable if you get too curious. So use emotional intelligence here. Never hurt. But it's good to be curious. Bottom line here, consistency is key. Whatever your interviewing process is, it should be the same every single time. Every single time, the same questions for every single person. There should be no difference. And the great thing about this is that this turns interviewing into a skill. This was a huge revelation for me personally when I started hiring people, when I realized that if I did the same thing every time, I could get better at this. Whoa, I could interview people in a meaningful way. I could become a better interviewer. What a concept. But you can only do that if your interview process is consistent, because you can't improve a skill that you're just randomly doing things. So when it comes to building a team, you got to push for diversity. You got to build a system for interviewing. The media doesn't really matter. And interviewing is a skill you develop. Now, this interviewing stuff is especially true in a distributed team, but it can be applied in any environment. So in summary, remember the forces at work. You're fighting space and time. When people aren't sitting in the same place, when they are in different time zones, you've got to think differently, and you've got to think about that stuff. You've got to make sure you're focused on effective communication the whole time. That is what you will need to be paying attention to time and time again. You've got to stay aligned. You've got to be in touch with people. If you do these things, you can run a distributed team. It's very possible. And here's the thing. Not all distributed teams are going to look the same. Not everybody's going to be a GitHub or an Elastic or a Valve or what have you. Find what works for you, but be systematic about it. Because distributed teams, from my perspective, they are the future. I've only been working distributed now for 10 years, more than half my career. And I plan to build and run teams that are distributed for the rest of my career if I have anything to say about it. Anyway, that's it. Thank you so much.